my Halloween plus a Valentine t-shirt today. I'm using, well, I checked in a new book that I have called Women Changing the World. It has a nice picture of someone who just had a birthday down here. No, on this side. Okay. Yes, it's the woman who ran for president of the United States on a national ticket in 2016. First woman to run for president on a national ticket, Hillary Clinton. She just had a birthday in late October. Should have mentioned her last month, but didn't. And so now I want to remember. Now, to go to some November birthdays, the first one is Sacagawea, the Indian woman who helped her French husband guide to lead the Lewis and Clark expedition that explored the New West that was purchased by Jefferson in 1803. And when Lewis and Clark set out, I believe it was 1805 by then, they went as far as to see the Pacific Ocean. And they met up with Sacagawea and her husband, a Frenchman who knew that territory. On the this side of the Rockies, the eastern side of the Rockies, she was able to help them, not so much with guiding per se, but just generally doing women's chores around the camp. She had a baby with her. The baby was later sort of adopted by Lewis and Clark, and when he grew up, he became a man who had an extensive life of his own. But this is Sacagawea as she might have appeared. We don't have a real picture of Sacagawea. She was born about 1786, and she was a Shoshone. There are a number of Shoshones in the West, and in fact, when I was fresh out of college, I taught on the Western Shoshone Reservation in northern Nevada, a part of which also extends into Idaho. For the 2nd of November, Jessie Daniel Ames, born in 1883. Now, she became famous for founding and heading a group called the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching, the ASWPL. Of course, lynching was a terrible act that was unfortunately frequently done, especially like in the late 19th century. But here is a woman who was a native of Texas, born in 1883, who worked to end the crime of lynching, Jessie Daniel Ames. For the 3rd of November, there's a picture that shows two people, and that's because the woman is Harriet Taylor Mill, and the man is John Stuart Mill, who was her husband, and a famous philosopher, political scientist sort of person in the 19th century. She was, this is a death date for Harriet Taylor Mill. She died at age 51 in France in 1858. She'd been married to a manufacturer named John Taylor, who was considerably older than she was. And she had 2 children, and she was a very bright person, and she took up with John Stuart Mill. That is to say, she visited him frequently, and she often even corrected his texts or made suggestions for things that he should write about and how he should write. So at one point, John Stuart Mill even suggested to her husband that he would be willing to have Harriet's name on some of his writings as a co-author. And the husband was very annoyed at that thought, which seems kind of strange, but I guess he wanted to make sure that people didn't associate her too closely with John Stuart Mill. But after Taylor, the husband Taylor, died, a couple of years after he died, the two of them married, and they were a married couple for several years before her early death in 1858. Harriet Taylor Mill, wife of John Stuart Mill. For the 4th of November, we have the Empress Theodora, and she is shown here in a mosaic picture, of course. She's shown with her husband, the Emperor Justinian. This was a famous Byzantine ruling couple, basically in the 6th century AD, which is why you see their pictures in mosaic, of course. Theodora was actually at one point a dancer as a young woman. She was a dancer, but she caught the eye of Justinian, who became later on emperor of the Byzantine Empire, and so she became the Empress Theodora. And she spent a lot of time actually in governing, and especially after his death, she governed by herself as the Empress Theodora for a number of years. And she was considered to be a very good administrator, and maybe even better than Justinian himself. November 5th is the birth date of Jacqueline Oriol, and she became a pilot. So, of course, we have a nice picture of her in an airplane. She was 30 years old when she learned how to pilot planes, and she set about making a number of winning awards, I guess I should say, really. She also broke speed records and that sort of thing. Jacqueline Oriol, born on November 5th in 1917. And she kept on learning new things. She learned how to fly helicopters, and in 1951, she broke the woman's airspeed record by traveling 570 miles an hour in one of the first Vampire jets. She was awarded the Legion of Honor. She was a French woman, born in France, and she broke her own speed record later on by traveling 534 miles per hour. She also became one of the first pilots to break the sound barrier, and to do that she had to fly 687.5 miles per hour. That was something she did in 1953. Jacqueline Oriol, born in 1917 in France, a famous pilot. For November 6th, we have Agrippina the Younger, and this is she was, of course, dating from Roman Italian times. She was the brother of an emperor, she was the wife of an emperor, and she was the mother of an emperor, Agrippina the Younger. She was the sister of Caligula, whom she married at 13. And after the Emperor Tiberius died, Caligula replaced him, and she gave birth to Nero. So she was the mother of Nero. And it's said that a fortune teller told her that she would be the mother of an emperor, but that the emperor would kill her. And she said, well, if he becomes emperor, that's good enough for me, and I won't worry about him killing me. Anyway, Nero is one of the most notorious of Roman emperors, in part because of his evil treatment of the Christians who were just getting started, basically, at the time that he was the emperor in Rome. Because Agrippina, as I mentioned, was born in 15 AD, so by the time Nero was around, it was, the middle of the 1st century AD. And he was a person who sent Christians in to fight lions barehanded, which of course they really didn't do. The lions killed them. But that was a blood sport in ancient Rome, was to have people that, especially ones that no one cared much about whether they lived or died, send them into the amphitheater and to fight bulls or lions or tigers or something like that. And that was something that was considered very popular, sort of like baseball today, Everybody wanted to go to the amphitheater to see the latest round of killings of Christians and other people who were not in favor with the emperor by wild beasts. But Agrippina the Younger is assigned to this day because, once again, this was so long ago that they really don't know when her birthday was, or perhaps they can't translate it into Christian calendar times. November 7th was the birthday of Maria Skłodowska in Poland in 1867. And she is more famous by her married name, Marie Curie, because she married the physicist Pierre Curie, who was a Frenchman, and she was noted in physics and chemistry herself. She worked with Pierre, and he died rather young. She continued on working in both physics and chemistry, and she was the first woman, well, she was the first person to receive 2 Nobel Prizes, one for physics and one for chemistry, because of her wonderful scientific gifts and the work that she did in those sciences, which were really just getting going about the time she was active, in the early days of the last century. Marie Curie. And she lived on until 1934, finally succumbing to radiation problems, because, of course, people who work with radioactive materials, as she did, are in danger of eventually dying from the exposure to radioactivity. So she did die eventually in 1934 of radiation poisoning. Marie Curie for November 7th. For November 8th, we have a beautiful actress of our own times, Katharine Hepburn, born in Connecticut in 1909. And her claim to fame, of course, she was a famous actress when I was a young girl even, but her real claim to fame is the fact that she won 4 Oscars. She's the only person who ever won that many, at least she was at the time they published my book here, definitely. She received more Oscars for Best Actress, namely 4, than most people ever got nominations for an Oscar. And she was in wonderful movies that I fondly remember. Little Women in the 1930s when she was quite young, but later on, The African Queen, which she played with Humphrey Bogart, and The Lion in Winter, Woman of the Year, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and On Golden Pond. Those last 2 were ones that she did when she was a pretty elderly person, actually. So she was an actress from the 1930s until the late 1960s, definitely, and a beautiful, very beautiful woman. Katharine Hepburn for November 8th. For the 9th of November, we have Anne Sexton. Her birth name was Anne Harvey. She was born in Massachusetts in 1928. So she's 4 years older than me. And she was a poet. My book compares her very much to another woman poet who was practically the same age. They were contemporaries, and that is Sylvia Plath. But Anne Sexton wrote poetry just like Sylvia Plath did. Plath herself died of a suicide in the early 1950s, if I remember correctly. But Anne Sexton lived on, 1928. However, she, like Plath, gassed herself to death. She committed suicide in the end. That was in 1974. She had been hospitalized for mental illness at various times over her years. But and actually the two knew each other, Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton. Anne Sexton lived for a longer time, until the 1970s. For November 10th, we have Lulu White. And this is, we found this, it mentions that she lived in a place called Storyville, which was actually on the outskirts of New Orleans. However, Storyville was the place where there were a lot of brothels, and Lulu White was probably the most famous madam of her time. She ran a brothel in the outskirts of New Orleans. Now, they're not sure exactly when she was born, but it says that she got started in the 1880s, so she must have been born around 1860 or thereabouts. And she eventually built this huge building, the brothel that she ran as madam in the Storyville district. And it was really large and full of mirrors. It says that the bedrooms all had mirrors on the top of on the ceiling over the bed and so forth, so that people could amuse themselves while they were in her establishment. 15 bedrooms. So Lulu White is someone we don't know exactly when she was born, but we do know that she was a very famous 19th century madam. For November 11th, we have a much, much different woman, Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams herself. Remember, she was the one who provided the title to the book that I use to read about and tell you about famous women of history. Abigail Adams was known for writing a lot of letters to her husband because she was living in Massachusetts holding down the homestead and taking care of the children and so on, while he was in New York City and then later in Washington, D.C., taking care of politics. She was married to John Adams, the second president of the United States, who had served as vice president under George Washington. So they have a lot of correspondence from the Adams family, her letters to John and his letters to her, and this one that has the title, or provides the title, Remember the Ladies, was from a letter that she wrote while he was working on in the predecessor to Congress under the Articles of Confederation, and they were working on setting up the new government of an independent United States of America. She wrote him saying, "Remember the ladies." And she even sort of joked, perhaps, to him, saying, because if you don't remember the ladies, maybe we will institute our own revolution. And of course he wrote back saying, "Oh, I must laugh at your strange ideas," saying, "Remember the ladies." But it has come down as a slogan for us women, I guess you might say, ever since. Abigail Adams wrote to John Adams to remember the ladies. Now, for the 12th of November, we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, here shown as an elderly woman. Many of the pictures of her show her like this, but actually she was, like everyone else, once quite a young woman. And when she was a young woman, she went with her husband to a meeting in London that was an abolitionist meeting. John, her husband, was quite involved with the abolition movement, getting rid of slavery. And she was also an abolitionist. Well, the women were allowed to sit and watch from the mezzanine, you know, up in the gallery, while the men, abolitionists, did the business of drawing up important papers and so on and so forth. But it was there that Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Lucretia Mott, who was a famous American feminist, an older woman. This was like about 1830 when Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Lucretia Mott for the first time at this abolition conference in London. But the two of them said, well, they had talked at the time in 1830 about, what about the women? Here's all this fuss about the slaves, but what about the women? Women can't vote, women can't have their own property. When they marry, their property goes into the name of the husband and that sort of thing, which was the case in 1830. So they said, well, we ought to try to do something about this, maybe sometime. Now, it just happened that in 1848, Lucretia Mott came to the town of Seneca Falls, New York, where she had a relative living and where Elizabeth Cady Stanton was living by that time. So they decided they would have a women's meeting. And they put a notice in the weekly newspaper, you know, something like came out on Tuesday, and they advertised that on Thursday they were going to have this women's meeting in Seneca Falls. And women came from all over to go to this meeting. And it was the start of the women's movement. It's officially the start of the women's movement in the United States at Seneca Falls in the summer of 1848. Susan B. Anthony wasn't there, but her parents were there, and she lived nearby in Rochester, New York. And so she became acquainted with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the two of them were the premier leaders of the women's suffrage and women's rights movement in the 19th century, in the late 19th century. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton is remembered as one of the pioneers of the women's rights movement. Now, she had 8 children. Luckily, 2 of them were girls. In fact, the oldest 2 were girls, and all the rest, the other 6 were boys. She was able to call on her daughters to sort of take care of the house and take care of the younger brothers and so on, while she traveled and spoke and so forth. And of course, after the children grew up, she didn't have to worry that much about them. And she did a lot of traveling. She spoke, although Anthony is probably the better known speaker. Stanton was an idea woman, and she did a lot of the writing for the women's rights movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, born in Johnstown, New York in 1815. For November the 13th, we have a woman called Lakshmi Bai, who was born in 1835 in India. And she's got a knife in her hand in this picture. She's riding on a horse. And actually, she was a famous part of the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857, which was when Indians, native Indian people rose up against English rule for the first time, you might say. And of course, the English continued to rule in India until 1948. This was 90 years earlier that the Sepoy Rebellion took place. And Lakshmi Bai was at the head of 300 women troops, it's said, at one time during the Sepoy Rebellion. But she died in battle in 1857. For November 14th, we have Fanny Mendelssohn, born in 1805. She was the sister of Felix Mendelssohn, who is a very well-known 19th century composer of music, classical music especially. And both he and his sister were very gifted musicians. They both studied piano. They both traveled Europe as child prodigies. But eventually Fanny Mendelssohn grew up and felt that it was time for her to live a more traditional woman's life, which she did. But she was praised in her time as a great pianist, and it's said that she also helped her brother Felix with some of his composition. For the 15th of November, we have Georgia O'Keeffe. She was born in Wisconsin in the year 1887, and she was a famous woman artist of the 1900s. She specialized in large pictures of large flowers, especially. I remember seeing some of those in art galleries. While she was still alive, she was a well-known national and international artist, painter. And so she may be the woman artist that most people know about. And she had these very modern, specific look to her paintings. Like I say, they were usually large bones or large flowers, and you still see them, of course, in art galleries around this country. For the 16th of November, there is another woman artist. Her name, Sophonisba Anguissiola. Actually, this was a death date for her, November 16th, in Palermo, in Sicily, in 1625. She was especially noted for her portraits, and in particular portraits of herself. Self-portraits have come down through the years since the 17th century when she passed away in Sicily. So she is shown in my book at the piano, or probably the harpsichord. She's shown at an instrument with keys that must be in a harpsichord. But like I say, she is best known for her self-portraits. And this picture that I have of her in black and white, not a nice color like you see on the screen, looks just like her. So we know just exactly what she looked like, since she did such lovely self-portraits of herself. The 17th of November is a death date. This was the death date in 1796 of Catherine the Great of Russia. Catherine II actually, and this shows her in her full Empress regalia with the blue sash, which is worn. You may have seen pictures of Queen Elizabeth II of England wearing one of those blue sashes, because that seems to be a sign of royalty, particularly for women who rule. And Catherine II of Russia was definitely a woman who ruled. She died in 1796, as I said, but of course she was active much earlier in that century. She was not Russian per se. In fact, she was a princess. She was a Prussian, i.e. East German princess, when she married into the royal family of Russia. And so she actually spent a lot of time as sole empress, because her husband died relatively young. And her mother-in-law was Elizabeth of Russia, who was Empress of Russia before her, and also a well-known woman ruler of Russia. But Catherine is well known as the Great, in part because she was the leader. Not that she actually led in battle, but she encouraged her generals to fight, especially in the Crimea, in the Black Sea, and for the Crimea, to capture the Crimea for Russia, and make sure that there was a good port on the Black Sea for the Russians, because the Volga River runs into the Black Sea, and to get to the Mediterranean, you have to, from Russia, you have to go through the Black Sea and by Turkey to get there. So Catherine the Great was considered great in large part because she also put down Cossacks. The Cossacks were mostly, you might say they were the professional soldiers of Russia, but they were the descendants of Mongols who had come from the Far East. And they were pretty much of a problem at one point in Russia until the time of Catherine the Great. But she employed them also once they had been put down from being trying to be independent. She put them to work, working for Russia itself as soldiers. So the Cossacks were famous, or infamous, perhaps, for being soldierly people in Russia. For the 18th of November is the birthday in 1939 of Margaret Atwood. She is a Canadian woman and an author in Canada. She was born in 1939, so she's a woman of our own time. In other words, actually she's younger than me. But she has written a lot of books, but probably the best known one is one of the most recent ones. It's called The Handmaid's Tale, and it's one of those anti-utopian books. Utopia, you know, is famously, it means no place. Topia, no place. But anti-utopian places, instead of being wonderful, glorious places to live as utopias were, they were dis-utopias, they were dystopias. And The Handmaid's Tale is a story of a dystopia in which men become so strong and ruthless that the women are essentially enslaved, and about all they can do is have babies, stay in kitchens, I guess, too, some. But The Handmaid's Tale is a famous modern dystopia written by Margaret Atwood, probably her most famous book, and certainly one that is still very much around with us. For the 19th of November, Indira Gandhi, born Indira Nehru, she was the daughter of the famous Prime Minister Nehru of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, first Prime Minister of India, and later on, after his death, she became Prime Minister of India as well. She was a woman well known for her interest in politics, and it's said that even as a child, like 4 years old or something, she enjoyed standing on a table and bossing the servants around and making speeches to the servants when she was just basically a little tiny girl. And she grew up to become a famous Indian politician and following in the footsteps of her father to become Prime Minister of India. She actually had two sessions of Prime Minister, which of course would mean that her party was in power on two different occasions. And actually, in the end, she was assassinated while she was still Prime Minister in India. That was in 1984. The Sikhs, who live in northern India, apparently were, not too happy to be under the control of Indians from other parts of India, and in particular Gandhi, and one of the Sikhs was her assassin. On the 20th of November, a woman was born in China. Well, she was born in China. She's assigned to the 20th of November. And she lived long, long ago, which is why you see this ancient painting of Wu Chao, born in China in 625. They don't know exactly what day of 625, but apparently they do have a birth year for her of 625, and she's been assigned to the 20th of November. She had a humble birth, but she was noted for her beauty, and here we see her dressed in a very fancy outfit. She became a concubine in the court of the Emperor of China, in about 640 or something like that, when she was a relatively young person. But she caught the eye of the emperor, and more importantly, you might say, she was the only one who bore him a son. And I was talking about Wu Chao, Empress in China. because her husband, the emperor, died relatively young, and so she was the Empress Dowager, and she was able to get rid of her enemies, dispatch them rather quickly, and rule pretty much by herself for a number of years in China. It's said that although she was ruthless to these enemies and got rid of them, bloodily speaking, she was a pretty good administrator, and she encouraged the arts, she kept the peace, she built a beautiful palace for herself, which is, I think, still around in Peking. And so she was noted in her time, even though she was born in 625, which is quite a few years ago, 1500 or so. For the 21st of November, there's a woman pilot named Phoebe Fairgrave Ames. She was born in Iowa in 1902, and this shows her with a plane because she was a person who won awards, broke records, and that sort of thing during her lifetime. And she was a stunt pilot as well, you know, doing things like flying. This used to be popular. Nowadays, you don't see it much, but back in the day when I was a young person, airplanes weren't that common in a way, and airplane travel was certainly not that common. And often when there was a county fair or something like that, one of the prime reasons that people came to the fair was to see pilots flying planes, and that was considered a great thing to be able to watch. So when she was born in 1902, that was just about when flying was invented in this country, and she became a pilot relatively young and did a lot of stunt flying. Probably went to a number of county fairs doing that flying. For November 22nd, we have Billie Jean King. Billie Jean King is a famous athlete, and she's the one on the left there, and she's holding a racket, a tennis racket. That's her best-known athletic skill, although she's been known to be active in other sports as well. One of the things that Billie Jean did that was quite memorable was to challenge a male winner of various you know, he was a tennis player who went all around the U.S. and around England and so on, playing tennis. His name was Bobby Riggs. And he was always saying things like, well, women may be tennis players, but I could beat any of them. I could beat any one of those women tennis players. So finally, Billie Jean King challenged him to a contest. Okay, she said, well, let's see what happens when we play, and let's see whether you beat me or not. And she said, and I plan to win. And she won. It turned out that Bobby Riggs, and this was in 1973, there were 30,000 spectators watching. this tennis match, and she beat him. So Billie Jean King is well known for being a tennis player. She was born in 1943, which makes her 11 years younger than me, which means that nowadays she's 75. She would be 75. For the 23rd of November, there's a woman called Xanthippe, and I'm not sure, yeah, we did get she was the wife of the famous Greek philosopher Socrates. So of course we have no idea what she really looked like. But this struck our fancy since, of course, we had nothing real to show you about Xanthippe, who was born in the 5th century BC, and they don't know the exact date. She's been assigned by the author of Remember the Ladies to the 23rd of November. And Plato famously wrote about her. You know, Socrates was followed by Plato, who was followed by Aristotle, and they are the three most famous philosophers, Greek philosophers of all time, and the ancient times, you know, centuries before the time of the birth of Christ. She was supposedly quite a bossy woman, shrewish woman, and Plato was always telling Socrates, you ought to make her behave, you know. She shouldn't be talking back to you or whatever it was that she was doing that Plato objected to. But Socrates was apparently a good husband, and he didn't chastise Xanthippe and so on in the way that Plato urged him to. For the 24th of November, Frances Hodgson Burnett. She was an author, especially an author of children's stories that she wrote. She was born in 1849, and she wrote books during the 19th century, books that were quite popular, children's books especially, and ones that I read. Now, I didn't care much about Little Lord Fauntleroy. That was the one that she's perhaps most famous for. Little Lord Fauntleroy seemed to be kind of a prig, you know. He was born in a time when boys were kept in girls' clothing until they were 5, often, you know, and so Little Lord Fauntleroy was along that line. He was only about 6 or something in the book, and he was a very sweet boy who was so good to his mama and so on. And he was the invention of Frances Hodgson Burnett. Now, she also wrote a book that was a great favorite of mine as a child, and I'm hoping that young people are still reading it. It's called The Secret Garden. And the story of that book essentially was about an Indian, actually a young English girl born in India who, after her parents' death, went to England, was very lonely and heartsick, having lost her parents and living in this big old house with no one except grown-up servants to sort of ignore her and so forth. But she discovered that there was a little boy there who was a crippled boy, and he was her cousin, actually. So they made good friends, and she had a friend who was the brother of the young maid woman who took care of her a lot. And they had heard that there was a garden that had been built but had been walled up because of the death of the young woman who had had the garden built in the first place. And so they called it the secret garden. Well, the children found it, and they actually found the big old key which would open the door, and they went into the secret garden and enjoyed themselves. And it had a happy ending because the crippled boy learned to walk in the secret garden. For the 25th of November, Carrie Nation, born in 1846 in Kentucky. Now, you see, she's got a hatchet in her hand. She was a very determined anti-saloon person. She was born, of course, in 1846 at a time when a lot of men were drinking a lot more than they ought to. Not that they don't still do that. But she went around with her hatchet and chopped up saloons. So she became famous for doing that in the 19th century. On November 26th, we have the death date of Sojourner Truth, who was born a free woman and who made a speech in Akron, Ohio, in 1851. After some men had been saying, you know, oh, women can't do anything, women shouldn't do anything, and so on. She went up there and said, hey, and she was a tall, you know, she was one of those 6 feet tall black women. And she said, ain't I a woman? Look at me. I can eat as much as you and so forth if I could get it. And she really rallied the women to her side. For the 27th, we have Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. And she was born in the 17th century. This shows her in her nun's habit. She wanted to be a scientist, but eventually she decided that was not too good, and she put away her scientific tools and just stuck to being a nun. 28th, Dona Briz in the Congo in the 17th century. And she really rallied the people in Africa where she was living, near the Congo, against the Portuguese, who eventually brought an end to her rule. She was in charge for about 5 years in an area near Nigeria, but they got rid of her, Dona Briz. 29th is for Tzu Shi, the little orchid, born in 1835. She was famous as China's last Empress Dowager. She was the mother of an emperor, and he died relatively young, and she chose a cousin to replace him, and she was actually doing much of the ruling herself for decades in China until her death in about 1910, Empress Dowager. And finally, Shirley Chisholm, a woman of our own day, born in 1924 with an extraordinary political career. She ran for president in 1972, and she was a Brooklyn native, Brooklyn, New York, born in 1924, and a famous politician.